Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest, in association with the NCPA. Co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. Before we meet on ground tomorrow at the NCPA, St. Paul's Institute and the Tidal Waves bookstore, we have some very intriguing and rousing online conversations lined up for you today. Do check out the full festival schedule on our website, tatalitlive.in. Our second session for the day, Invisible Wars, How the World's Deadliest Conflicts Go Unreported, sheds light on how most news that reaches us is routed through the Western world. What does it then mean for an experienced correspondent to cover neglected conflicts, revealing the truth of how no one can remain untouched by the loss of life and scale of disaster, and how that turmoil seeps into his personal life? Anjan Sundaram explores this and more in his new book, Break Up, A Marriage in Wartime. In conversation with him is journalist and writer Raghu Karnad. Over to you, Raghu.
Thank you very much. Hi, Anjan. How are you?
I'm well. Lovely to see you, Raghu.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. So I was thinking about how to begin this session, how to introduce the book, and what I ought to say about it at the outset. And of course, I remembered that in August, before this event was planned and before either of us knew we'd be speaking, I read Break Up and I wrote you an email. So in the interest of journalistic honesty and candor, I thought the best thing to do would be to read a few lines of my reaction from the email that I wrote you back in August. So I said that I had just moved to Bombay. Things were a little chaotic and I wasn't sure how soon I would get to reading it. Quote, but I did hand it over to my partner to look at, and she began browsing the first few pages. And then you know how this goes. In 48 hours, we'd both blazed through the book, pulling it back and forth between us. It's an amazing achievement. Just as prose, so clear, but so penetrating, both at home and in the field. And I learned things, many things that I'm glad to know about writing, but also about everything else. And I concluded saying, I hope the next time we'll be able to sit down, eat, and talk about it. And here we are. We are sitting, we are not eating, but finally get to talk about it. So congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you to the team at Tata for giving us this opportunity and pairing us up coincidentally.
Yeah, coincidentally. Well, there's a lot to cover. And much of it you've spoken about over the years. Some of it is common to the books that you've written previously, and some of it is, I think, brand new. There's your journalistic commitment to this enormously important region of the world. There's your personal understanding, your perspective on the biases and the distortions in this global journalistic industry. And what's, I think, possibly new is your book's very intimate treatment of family and love and the strains of work and of distance and of danger. So we'll hopefully move through all of it. I want to begin with a line that is that's exceptional, that really is one of many lines that stands out in the book. And it takes place in a scene when you and your and a collaborator who is a reporter from the Central African Republic are resting at night. And correct me if I've got the details wrong. He's looking, the moon is overhead and you're looking up and he says, I think people know more about the moon than they know about this country. One of the reasons that line jumped out at me, is that embarrassingly, it was true of me. I literally did know more about the moon than I knew about the Central African Republic. To some extent, it's true about other countries you've written about Congo and Rwanda, but more than any of them, it's true about the CAR. I think it's fair to say people don't know it exists, a country the size of Texas. And you talk about contacting editors when you were setting out to write this piece, saying you wanted to go to the Central African Republic. And their response was, yeah, but which Central African Republic? So just lead us through the experience of your prior books and how and what brings you to this one, a country that is even more marginalized from global conversation and attention than any of them?
Oh, thank you, Raghu. Yes, and that was Thierry, my reporting partner. We call them fixers, but really, uh, they're so vital to our reporting projects, to our teams when we travel. They're so crucial to deciding where we go and understanding what we're seeing. That they're really more central than the term fixer could ever, convey. Thierry, for example, in the Central African Republic, who said that about the moon, he's been covering his country for 10 years, and Lewis and I sort of arrived there to travel through the Central African Republic. But I can move back a little bit to how I began to report on that region. I was so I grew up I grew up in Dubai. I was studying at Rishi Valley. I spent a year at IIT Madras, and then I moved to Yale, and where I studied mathematics. And one day in the lunch hall at Yale, I opened the newspaper, New York Times, middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page. There was an article about the war in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it said 4 million people at the time had been killed. And it was this tiny article in the middle of the newspaper, and I wondered, how is this not on the front page? How can something so large, 4 million people dead, now it's 5 or 6 by the official counts. How can something so large, so many people affected, refugees, rebels, rebellions, how can that be buried in the middle of the newspaper? And sort of piqued my curiosity, and one thing led to the next. And I was paying my final bill at Yale, and the cashier was African. I asked her, "Where are you from?" She had an African accent. She said Zaire, which is the old name for Congo. And I said, I'm going to go to the Congo. And she said, "Oh, you stupid Yale kids, you can't even sign a check. I could steal all your money. And you're going to go to the Congo? No, like you're going to get robbed or killed. You're just idiots." And so she said, "No, you can't go." And so she had a second job at a parking lot on Chapel Street in New Haven. And I used to go and hang out with her, buy her Dunkin' Donut milkshakes. And then finally she said, after a lot of hanging out, she said she accepted that I could stay with her in-laws in Kinshasa. So that's how I, got my first in. I felt, I can live with a local family. I'm not in a hotel. I have an inside view of society. So I bought a one-way ticket to Kinshasa. I had no journalism experience. I sort of showed up in Kinshasa and began to try and report. And so that was the first book, Stringer, Reporter's Journey in the Congo. Is about my, coming of age in Congo, trying to become a journalist. It was hard work. I didn't know how to write an article. I didn't know how to publish anything. For the first couple of months, I couldn't pay my rent. And so Nana, the woman of the house, one day she sat me down and said, I complained that I couldn't. I should not complain. I apologized that I couldn't pay the rent because I hadn't sold any articles. And she said, "What have you studied? What did you study?" And I said, "Math." And she said, "You idiot. Of course you can't sell a story. Like, what's wrong with you?" And she said, my sister-in-law in New Haven sent me a bad deal. This is terrible. You're never going to be able to publish a story. So that was the beginning in Congo. And the book is very much about me trying to survive by selling news, and also me trying to understand what makes the news and what's left out, more importantly. And so a lot of the book are the stories that are left out of the news, because the stories that Nana told her child at home were very different from the stories that I was reporting for the Associated Press, for whom I became a stringer. And if journalists write the first draft of history, then how is what I'm reporting so different from the stories Congolese are telling? So a lot of the book, dwells on that. The second book, I then moved from Congo to Rwanda. I trained a class of about a dozen Rwandan journalists, print journalists, who were taken out one by one as I was teaching them. So shot dead, imprisoned, forced to flee the country. And after criticizing the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. And I hid one of the journalists, one of my students, in my home, helped him get out of the country and get asylum abroad. And really the book is about their stories and about my education in journalism, by being able to follow them, which was a privilege. As a foreigner, again, the most the Rwandan government would do to me is throw me out. But for them, they were risking everything. And maybe this hits home in some way for yourself as well. And many reporters who are now working in India, sort of not quite as stark, but so many of the Rwandan journalists I was following, they were risking their families, their lives, in some cases, bank loans, kids at school, land, all of that was at risk, but none of which was the case for me. And so it was incredible to be able to follow them. And, it was a privilege to have a front row seat as they were risking everything to hold their government accountable, hold power, abuses of power accountable. And so that book is about to pay homage to the work of these brave reporters in a country where the free press, as my class was destroyed, those 12 reporters, the free press in the country was also silenced. And in the appendix of the book, there's, I list about 70 Rwandan reporters who disappeared, were killed, forced to flee the country, tortured, after criticizing the president and the government of Rwanda. And so it's really, many of their names can't be spoken in Rwanda today because they're seen as enemies of the state. And so the book was to pay homage and remember their brave work. And so then that brings me to the Central African Republic. And, in Rwanda, I met a Human Rights Watch researcher, Louis Mudge, who became a good friend. We were both reporting and researching Rwanda together. And then, and at one point, he began covering the Central African Republic, and we'd heard rumors that there was going to be a genocide there of the Muslim population in the Central African Republic. And as you mentioned, this country is so obscure that very few people even know it exists, even know its names. The editors I asked to fund my journey asked me which Central African Republic I wanted to go to. And the name of the country has a very beautiful history. Barthélemy Boganda, who was an independence hero and mysteriously died in a plane crash, some say by the French, orchestrated by the French. He called it the Central African Republic because after independence, he wanted all the African countries to band together, be united in against and form a bloc, political, economic bloc, and not be torn apart by European powers seeking to divide and conquer yet again in the aftermath of colonialism and independence. And so he named it the Central African Republic, sort of as a country that might form part of a United States of Africa, like a United States of America. And the Central African Republic at the heart of the country would form alliances mostly with West African nations. But yeah, that was kind of the background to my journey in the Central African Republic. I traveled through for nearly a month, and it was a very crucial time because it was a time journalists very rarely arrive in a place before genocide or ethnic cleansing. Usually we arrive, too late or never. And in this case, we happened to be and travel through the country as the Muslim population was being dehumanized, as the rebel groups, Christian rebel groups, began to, formulate plans in remote parts of the country, which were very inaccessible and not frequented even by the French peacekeepers, heavily armed. And Louis and I we traveled through these areas and began to meet these rebels and understand what was really going on, and paint a picture of what a country feels like before a massive ethnic cleansing. By the end of it, the statistics are completely wild. In the capital alone, 400,000 Muslims were cleansed. Muslims began to flee the country, organize these convoys to leave peacefully and leave to other countries. And even as they were driving out, they were attacked. Their children were attacked. So some of them sought refuge in mosques, and they were attacked there. So it was a real campaign to clean the country of Muslims who were a minority already in the Central African Republic. And there was a sense that they had forgotten their place. And so there's an interesting colonial history that they were trying to reverse. But that was a backdrop to the journey that we made and what we were trying to document, all these massacres and killings that even 5 kilometers outside the town, no one knew had happened because people were too scared to talk about it.
Yes. And one of the amazing things about the book is that, the reader gets to kind of ride along on your shoulder at very intimate quarters from you, hearing a lot of your own sort of your conversation and your own mental monologue as you enter a place that is defined by uncertainty. You don't actually know what's going on. You don't know. I mean, you have this intuition and you have information, but essentially nobody in our position internationally knows what's going on, and you have to rely a lot on being undeterrable, I would say. But before we go into the actual narrative of the book, I really like this note you mentioned about the name of the Central African Republic, how it comes from something that's not as mundane as it might sound. One thing that I admire very much about how you framed the events in this country is that you're not just framing it as a humanitarian emergency, which is, after all, a fairly familiar framing for political events in Africa, but as a historical development. Like, this is history playing out. And these are countries that are societies taking part in the arc of world history, even if we aren't aware of it, and even if we are kind of marginalizing them from the history that matters. You did something interesting, and which is that you did a PhD in journalism in the middle of writing all of these books. What is it that you came to understand about the way we report on the world, and how it is that history, a war that kills millions, matters so much in one place, matters so little in another?
Great questions, Raghu. The point about world history, I think, echoes something I read before I traveled even to Congo. When I was a student at Yale, I read an interview of the great Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski. He was interviewed by Granta magazine by Bill Buford, and in that interview, Bill Buford asks him, why are you going to these places? And one of the things Kapuscinski says that inspired me, this is 15 years ago, 15 years before I traveled to the Central African Republic, was Kapuscinski said, in these places, he was in Africa in the 60s and 70s during this wave of independence, coup d'etats, revolutions. Human history was unfolding before his eyes. It was history in the making. And he asked in that interview, he said, where were the writers? Where were the poets? Where were the philosophers? All these people who write about the human condition, they weren't there. It was just me and a couple of blokes, a couple of hacks, journalistic hacks, just watching this and reporting on this, documenting this for the world. It seemed an immense responsibility. And then he said, they weren't there. And then he said he went back to Europe and he found them, in Paris, in London. And that was part of what inspired me. And, what he said, I made phone calls after reading that interview to some journalist alumni in the US. And I asked them, is this still the case? And they said, absolutely. Central Africa, especially in Congo, especially, it's full of news, important news, news that's important for the world, events that are crucial to our understanding of human history, 21st century history, and yet no one's there. And so, that was one of the reasons, one of the things that motivated me to travel there. I thought, there's important events. There aren't that many reporters. Maybe there's something that I can contribute here. And so that rings. It really sort of, rings true, and something close to my heart, to the project, the mission I'd set out for myself, and the reason, right, the purpose that I'd set out for myself before I went out. To hear you say, I'd framed this as part of world history, this war in the Central African Republic and what was going on there. And indeed, it was. The Central African Republic was ruled by Muslim kingdoms before the French arrived in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. And they defeated these Muslim kingdoms. And though everyone's forgotten about these Muslim kingdoms, the 100 years since, the Muslim communities there haven't forgotten. And this war was initiated by a group of them trying to reclaim their lost glory, and push out the West and push out. And they have succeeded to some degree. They pushed out France, which for the last 150 years has been the dominant power in that region. They pushed out France, and now Russia has moved in, and there's the infamous Wagner group that is set up in the Central African Republic, that's mining diamonds and gold, that's sending money to Russia, to Ukraine, to recruit fighters for the war in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's become central to one of the most important conflicts. Thousands of kilometers away. That's just an aside, and just to show how these seemingly obscure and remote places can play very central roles to our understanding of world history, to our understanding of current events. the other point I wanted to touch upon was your comment at the top, at the beginning of our conversation about your ignorance. And I think, about this war, and what I wanted to say to that was that's exactly my purpose. Is exactly to speak to readers like yourself, and the way I do that is to begin the story often with my ignorance, because these are remote countries, and many journalistic accounts are written from a place of authority. To say I spent 3 years in Congo. Let me tell you let me inform you. And the way I've written all these 3 books is to start not from that place of authority, but to start from the place at which I knew very little about the country. Because often for the Congo, for Rwanda, for the Central African Republic, there was a point at which I became interested in what was going on there, but I knew very little. And I like to start my stories there as a way of inviting the reader to sit on my shoulder, as you said, and travel with me as we learn together. And the reader may have a job, family, and can't just go there, doesn't have the experience, but I can go there for both of us, and I can share my experience learning about the war, about the country as we go along, from a place of some privilege, as a journalist, as a war reporter, as someone based in that region. But the intention is to travel together and learn together, not to talk down to the reader or talk from a place of a position of authority, but rather to say we both might not know a lot, so let's go together and learn as we travel through these villages or these scenes of massacres, or into rebel zones, rebel headquarters. That's really to convey that experience in as much as I can in real time to the reader. To your question about how international news is structured in the PhD, I learned a great deal. I was doing my PhD and I kind of lucked out. I had one of my advisors. His name is Anshuman Mondal. So I learned a great deal from both my advisors. My first advisor was Giles Foden, who wrote The Last King of Scotland. He was my principal advisor, and my second advisor, who Giles found for me, was Anshuman Mondal, and he's a post-colonial researcher. And he began to give me all this reading, all these books. I remember calling producers, TV producers, other journalists, and calling them and saying, "Remember that time the commissioning editor said this? There's a whole theory for why they said that, why they said no to our idea. There's a whole theory. We had no idea." And I was like reading all this theory to them. It blew my mind. And the kind of the understanding I came out with was the international news system is still structured by colonial power relations. And a lot of the books, a lot of journalist memoirs, a lot of how news is constructed is still, if journalist memoirs, for example, they're often written from positioning the foreign correspondent as some kind of hero, and that relates to the colonial officer sent out from colonial centers like London or Paris, sent out to the peripheries of the world to extract information from, in this case, local journalists, transform it, send it back to the global centers, colonial centers, and often take credit and prizes and financial credit and all of that often goes to the foreign correspondent. And that's how international news is still structured, and that's a very colonial model. There were a number of sort of interesting findings that that it kind of opened my eyes. For example, in the Vietnam War, I didn't know, but photographers with foreign-sounding names were not credited. This is official AP policy, Associated Press policy. Kind of blows my mind. In the 70s, this was official policy. It's quite recent, and these practices echo today. And local reporters like Thierry, whom we began by speaking about, there's a tradition of just paying them off, extracting all this valuable knowledge that they've gained from 10 years, from a decade of reporting or more, extracting all of this and then presenting it to the world as if it's the foreign correspondent's kind of discovery. And one of the purposes of this book was, to place Thierry, the Central African reporter, in a central role to show how at key points in our journey, it was Thierry who made the decisions, who decided where we would go, because he was the one who was calling his local journalist friends, and they were telling us where news was happening, their intuition for where we should go, as you said, it was a journey of a lot of uncertainty. We would hear about maybe, a massacre happened, but we wouldn't know how many people were killed, who did the killing, why, when. And we had to move by intuition. And a lot of that intuition came from traveling with a local reporter, a Central African reporter, who had a network of colleagues and was able to make those phone calls. And then we could intuit, where it might be promising to travel to. So all of these realities of reporting, publishing are not really spoken about. And it's even though there's a whole post-colonial theory, it hadn't been applied to journalism, is what Anshuman told me. And so my PhD thesis was applying some of those post-colonial theories to news production, news publication, and to understand the reality that I was living in. Just to complete one of the stories I called my producer friend about was I made a TV show about India. I presented a TV show called Deciphering India. And after we did that, Trump was elected. And so I pitched to the Singaporean national channel, Channel News Asia. I said, why don't we do Deciphering America? Now's the moment. And they came back to us and said, why don't you do Indians in America? We were like, no, we want to do America. They were like, how about Asian tycoons in America? We were like, no, we want to do America. What's the problem? And I didn't understand until I did my PhD that it wasn't, it was really about a smallness in the mind. It's a psychological smallness. It's a legacy of colonialism that the Singaporean editors don't believe that we have the authority as an Asian crew to go to the US and report in the US in the same way that an American crew has been coming to India for decades and reporting on India, these definitive stories without a problem, without any questioning. We don't have that in Asia yet. And that's something I would like to see.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we could unpack those themes and those subjects for hours, I'm sure. So, but I don't want to miss talking about all of the stuff that is particular to this book, and to your writing. So I think your position in this book, since you mentioned that foreign correspondents are often presented as heroes, I know exactly what you mean. Your role in this book is not unheroic. What it does certainly is it complicates your position as a protagonist and as the narrator a lot. It does put Thierry, it makes Thierry very visible, which I have huge respect for, and which I think is completely essential to how journalists treat their collaborators and quote unquote fixers. And more than anything, like your other books, it has this interiority. Your notes are as much about what's happening outside. I can tell that what you're presumably writing in your notebook at the end of the day is also introspective and about what you are dealing with, your fear, your doubt, your exhaustion. And in the context of this book, also the pressure work is putting on your relationship and vice versa. So since you're leading us in not from a position of authority, but from outside of authority, it helps that the book starts in Shippagan, in a cozy fishing town in Newfoundland, in coastal Canada, arguably the furthest you could be from the Central African Republic in sort of atmospheric terms. And you have a very young child. You're a new parent, and this is one of the things that that will play out through the story as your reporting does. It's not a spoiler to say the title of the book is Break, a marriage in, and it's not a spoiler to say that this reporting trip puts huge strain on your marriage, and it does, and your marriage does end at the end of it. I'm not going to ask you to get into that, but I'm very curious about how you wrote about it. Were you worried about how describing this would come off? Your impulse to go out and report when you have a very, very young child, did it matter to you to look like a good guy, and not in the field, but in the home?
It's a good question. I think it's a topic that's really fraught in many ways. So there's a lot of it can be a minefield, and so one of the reasons why this book took a long time to write was because I wanted to convey how important family and the marriage was to the kind of reporting that I was doing. my ex-wife Nat, she's a former war correspondent herself. We met in the Congo on the front line of the war. So at the beginning of the journey, there was a great deal of understanding on her part, and we spoke about Thierry. She was the one who found Thierry for me. She found his connection, and she introduced me to him as a way of keeping me safe and helping me on this journey to report what I wanted to report. And it took me a long time to write, because after the divorce, after the breakup, the divorce, as often there's a period of resentment, there's a period of a sense of loss. And every time whenever I try to write this book, or the opening scenes of the book, during that period, I felt a great deal of resentment at having lost what was a very beautiful marriage for me. It was a marriage that I'd chosen to have a child with her. I felt I wanted to be with Nat for the rest of my life. I decided this was a relationship for me. This was our marriage, and then I lost it. And then I lost something so beautiful, and that took a while for me to accept. And so, and I didn't want to write about the period before this journey with any of that resentment. I wanted to write about how beautiful it was, how important she was to me, how encouraging, how supportive, how without that kind of familial support, this kind of journey would have been far more difficult, maybe inconceivable. And so that took time for me to get over the breakup and divorce, and to write about what a beautiful person she is, what a beautiful marriage we had shared. And then of course, our marriage, the first fraying of our marriage plays out across this relationship, and then I come back to Canada, and it becomes very complicated. Was it important to portray myself? I think it was important for me to portray both of us, Nat and me, Nat, my ex-wife, and me, as understandable, not necessarily as virtuous. Obviously, we had, we both had our, moments when we were not our best selves, but at least to portray where we had come from, to the extent that I could, for her, and for me, for myself, what I experienced. And to be honest, the breakup, the end of the marriage, there are things about it I still don't understand. Nat herself is a writer, she's a journalist. I would love to read her account, because I kind of don't understand quite what happened. And that was partly why it was so hard to get over the marriage. That there was always a sense in me that if I don't understand, then maybe there's something I don't understand that I can fix. And often that didn't prove true. So we have a good relationship now, but there was a period when it was very difficult for us to both understand and co-parent our child, who was very young. I'm happy to say that we're now in a much better place. I sent Nat the book close to its publication. To your question about whether I was nervous, I was, and so I didn't know how she would react. I didn't. At the same time, I wanted this to be my book, my telling of the story, my side of the story. I would love for her to tell hers, but I wanted to write it true to myself. So I wrote it, and close to its publication, the US publication earlier this year, I sent her a copy, and she called me up and she said, thank you for portraying me as nicer than I was at the time. So I thought, okay, this is a victory. This is, I feel like I was true to myself, and she feels that I understood her. My daughter came to visit me in Mexico, where I'm living now. Over Christmas, Rafael, she came to visit me, and she saw proof of the book. And she said, I know what that, she read the title, and she's now 10 years old. She was 9 years old then. And she read the title. She said, breakup. She said, I know what that book's about. You should throw that book in the bin. And that was her reaction to the book. Yeah. But last month, I did, in August, I did a book event with Lewis. I visited Lewis with Rafael, and I visited him in Vermont. And we did a book event at the local library, my first event with Lewis together, describing the journey. And Rafael was there. And it was really moving for me to describe the breakup, the journey, my relationship with her when she was a year old, and to have her sit there and listen to me. And I asked her after the talk, what did you think? And she was like, I didn't know everyone knew me and knew who I was. And that was her takeaway. So I think it's a real experiment. It's to write about not only the war, which I think is, journalists often do, but also the personal context for the reporting on the war, to turn the camera on myself and on my family, and to do this in a public way, I think it's an experiment that's playing out as as the years go by, and I don't know how people are going to react. And it's an interesting experiment. I think it's part of my relationship with Raphael, my daughter, to have done this, and it's part of my way of, even though I'm not a daily parent with her. It's part of my way of connecting with her and reflecting on my relationship and continuing to develop that bond with her. Is both private in our conversations when I put her to bed. I read her stories or whatever, or at night, or it's on Skype. And it's also in this public way, writing about our relationship and the circumstances that led us to this physically estranged relationship, but writing about it in a public way in books.
Well, I have to say, I really admire it for a couple of reasons. One is that I've always felt that a great piece of reportage is usually when you find a great piece of reportage in the world, there's an equally great unwritten piece about the background to that reportage and the other things the journalist was going through. Apart from that, it's also true that we are, our generation has its own work to do demythologizing the figure of the heroic and intrepid reporter, and also just of the different roles that men and women get to play at work and at home. You're one of the things that you are beautifully candid about, and there's a lot of texture that you share about your relationship. Is that, I mean, the one thing that I got from it is that Nat was probably burning up with jealousy, being unable to do this kind of thing anymore because there was no choice for her, and you were torn in two directions. That's perfectly clear. There's
right.
Yeah. Well, jump in if you want to talk about any of this. But...
No, I think it's complicated for her, right? I think it's more complicated, and it's more complicated even. I noticed that as we were separating and getting divorced, in the aftermath of the story of this book, it's complicated. There's a lot more judgment. Again, I'd love to read her and hear her on these topics, but I think it's far more complicated for a mother to say, I'm leaving my child behind and I'm going off to a war. And I think it's because of historical precedent and societal norms. It's not simple, but it's simpler and it's more understandable. It's more accepted for men to be in that position. So, yeah. And that's something that I lay out, and it was part of our conversations and the texture of our relationship, and I lay it out for readers.
But I won't lie. Like I said, I was reading it with my partner. We were pulling the book back and forth, and we both managed to read it within 48 hours. But there were points when she was furrowing her brow about your decision to head out, despite the fact that your wife at the time, your ex-wife, was on board with it. There's another thing I want to talk about, though, and this is as much about your relationship. It's about the sense we get of the trauma that you're carrying back. Now, the book, if the book teaches us about anything, well, it teaches us about a lot of things. So kudos. One thing it teaches us about is how the experience of danger, even if you're only acting as a witness, and even if you leave physically unharmed, how it changes you. I've experienced that in small ways myself when reporting in places where you are at risk. It always leaves you with a deeper sense of how much more at risk other people are. But I mean, the local people who live there are, and the reporters you're working who live there are. But in this story, you are truly you truly spend time in some very dangerous and hair-raising, undoubtedly traumatic situations, traumatic to you. Tell me if you disagree with this word, but also tell me about bringing that back home and what you've learned about managing. You've been, now having done all of the reporting you have, what have you learned about experiencing, processing, managing the burden that you carry back with you?
Yeah, so thank you, Raghu. I think these personal, global range of questions. I think one of the things I wanted to convey was, at least as I experienced having a child, starting a family, there's a responsibility to the family, and there's also a responsibility I felt to our community, to the world, to our work. And I think this book tries to describe the tension, that many journalists and frontline, human rights defenders and many people experience, but we rarely write about because we're not encouraged to write about it because it's traumatic. I guess two little quick points, I guess, on the trauma or the risk. It's really made it's made worthwhile, or the sense of purpose that I get is from encountering heroes, true heroes, really inspiring people, heroes who are not trying to be heroes in the field, people whose circumstances have pushed them to a position where, for example, there's a Polish priest who, I described in the west of the country, and he's traveling through war zones where there's no phone signal. He's collecting pages, handwritten pages from village after village, and I traveled with him as he was doing this, where people were writing by hand who was sick, what medicines they needed. That's really heroic work. And I said to him, "You're a war reporter," and he said, "No, I don't have any bylines." I said, "Well, you're doing the work, and this is how, in the 21st century, in the age of Twitter, we think we're inundated with information. We have everything. We know everything about the world. It's not true. It's people like him who are doing groundwork, in places like the Central African Republic, telling us what's happening in these war zones." In terms of managing this kinds of, the stress, it's something I realized this year, that writing in the first person, writing memoirs, seeing myself as a character allows me some distance with the person I was at that time. And, as someone who's done therapy, this is an essential part of therapy, to see yourself from the outside and speak to yourself. And writing the books has been therapeutic. And I didn't realize this when I wrote the first one, but there are many reasons, as I explained, for writing in the first person. But this is one of them, something that I realized recently, that it helps me process the emotions, good and bad, and difficult and ecstatic, that I experienced in those places, and allows me in that way to continue this work, by seeing myself as a character, by describing myself from the outside, taking some distance from myself. Because often the trouble is that we relate too closely to the emotions and we can't get away from them. And I think the act of writing is essential to the reporting, has become essential to the reporting, because it's part of how I process what I experienced there. But I can't stress enough, like as you say, yes, I'm taking risks. Yes, you've taken risks. But the people who are living in these places are taking, in my view, 100 times more risk than we are as reporters. And we're only there for a short period. And so the risk they're taking justifies my journey in these places, justifies my being there, justifies the whole project. And in this case, unfortunately, it had implications for the family, for my own family, for my daughter. Part of the story, part of the purpose was to convey to my daughter, there are different ways to live. There's a private way to live, and that's noble. And there's a way also that's more public, that accounts for our responsibility to our communities, to our broader communities as well. And that's something, when I thought about being a father, who I wanted to be as a father, there was a possibility to let go of that work or to diminish it in a very fundamental way. And I decided initially, together with Natalie, my ex-wife, that we would not do that, because that's something we wanted to pass on to our child. And so in some way, even though Nat disagreed in the end along on the journey, that's something that I've tried to stay true to and to continue. And so, for better or worse.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Now, that's a good note to end on, although I would happily talk for hours more. I'm glad we got to cover the scope and the kind of amazing emotional scope and factual scope of this book. Congratulations. And
thank you, Raghu. Yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation, in India when I come next, or right, in the States. Whenever we meet next, we can hopefully, get a drink and talk more. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and the way in which you engaged, you and Abhi, your partner, the way you've engaged with the text. And, I really am grateful. It's a it's a reward as a writer to have such thoughtful and deep readers.
Thank you so much for the wonderful session. A big thank you to our audience for joining us online today. This would not have been possible without our sponsors. Title sponsor Tata in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, and powered by Godrej and Kotak. Do remember we meet in person on the 27th, 28th and the 29th of October. Our next session online at 8 p.m. is Free and Unfair: How Special Economic Zones Undermine Democracy. See you there.